Chapter 1. The Eternal Whisper. Before the sound of Roman sandals echoed across Europe, the land was quiet, though not empty. In central Italy, where the 7 hills of Rome would one day rise, the earth told older stories. This place was called Latium, a rolling land of forests, rivers, and soft, fertile plains that brushed the Tyrrhenian Sea. Long before Rome, this region cradled 3 ancient peoples, the Etruscans, the Latins, and the Sabines. Their lives were shaped by the cycles of the sun and moon, by storms that swept in from the coast, and by the trembling earth beneath their feet. The Etruscans who lived to the north were skilled builders, astronomers, and seers. They carved their homes into hillsides and built cities laced with sacred roads. They read omens in lightning, in the flight of birds, and in the livers of animals. To them, the world was full of signs. Their temples sat atop high places looking skyward. Their tombs were shaped like houses for the dead, suggesting a life beyond this one. To the south and centre lived the Latins, a people of farmers and shepherds. They were quiet, earthbound folk who placed their trust in rituals and harvests. They worshipped woodland gods, simple spirits tied to trees, rivers, and thresholds. Their language, Latin, would one day echo through empires, but in these early days it was used mostly to bless crops and call animals home. And in the rugged hills eastward lived the Sabines, tough mountain people with strong customs and fierce pride. They believed in honor passed through generations and lived by traditions older than written memory. Their legends were told by firelight, guarded by elders. Though these 3 groups were different, their worlds touched. They traded goods, married, across tribes and sometimes fought. But all of them looked up to the same stars, felt the same rain, and feared the same sudden tremors from the ground. In the soft silence before empire, they shaped a culture from soil and stone, from sky and spirit. These people were not yet Roman, but the soul of Rome was already stirring beneath their feet. Waiting, the twins and the wolf. According to legend, the birth of Rome began not with politics or war, but with a story, a myth etched deep into the Roman heart. It begins with twin boys, abandoned and wild, Romulus and Remus, sons of the Vestal Virgin. Rhea Silvia, fathered, some said, by the god Mars himself. Others claimed a mortal man had taken her by force. Whatever the truth, their birth was seen as dangerous to the ruling king of Alba Longa, a man named Amulius. Fearing prophecy, he ordered the babies drowned in the river Tiber. But the river did not obey. The waters carried the twins gently downstream, as if guided by something older than fate. Their cradle came to rest beneath a fig tree, its roots clinging to the edge of the Palatine Hill. And there, in the hush of the forest, a she-wolf found them. She did not harm them. Instead, she suckled them, offering milk and warmth, guarding them as her own. Some say she had lost her own pups and took the boys in out of sorrow. Others say it was divine will. Either way, it was a moment that would echo across centuries. The image of the she-wolf and the twins became a symbol of Rome itself, fierce, nurturing, wild. Eventually, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the twins and brought them home. Raised among people but shaped by nature, Romulus and Remus grew strong. They laughed together, fought side by side, and dreamed of building something lasting, something of their own. But destiny is not always kind to brothers. As they grew, they learned of their royal blood and overthrew King Amulius. Power returned to their grandfather, yet the twins did not stay. They wanted a city, not a palace. They sought to mark their own ground. It was then, as young men standing upon the hills where the she-wolf had found them, that rivalry bloomed between them. A city born from fratricide Romulus and Remus stood upon neighbouring hills, Romulus on the Palatine, Remus on the Aventine. Both claimed a vision, both desired to lead, and both believed they were favoured by the gods. But the gods were silent. To resolve their dispute, they turned to augury, an ancient practice of watching birds. To divine will, Remus saw 6 vultures first, but Romulus claimed to see 12. The people argued, the air grew tense, words sharpened. Then came the act that would forever shape Rome's soul. In one version of the story, Remus mocked the walls his brother had begun to build, jumping over them to show how weak they were. In another, he simply crossed the sacred line Romulus had drawn in the soil. Either way, Romulus responded with iron. He struck his brother down. A brother's blood soaked the earth. The silence afterward was deep, heavy. Romulus stood alone. Whether with regret or cold triumph, he began to build. Stone by stone, ditch by ditch, he founded the city. He named it Rome after himself. He welcomed fugitives, shepherds, wanderers, any who would follow his rule. And so Rome rose. Not from harmony, but from sacrifice. Not with peace, but with dominance. The city's first act was fratricide. This tale, half myth, half memory, reveals something deeper than history. Rome would be a place of order, but also of ambition. It would build wonders and spill blood. It would become eternal, but never gentle, the sacred boundary. As Romulus laid the foundations of his city, he drew more than walls. He traced an invisible line around the Palatine hill. This line was the Pomerium, a sacred boundary. It was not just practical, it was spiritual. To cross it carried meaning far beyond geography. The Pomerium was older than law. It came from Etruscan rituals carried into Latin custom. When Romulus marked the boundary, he did so with a plough drawn by a white ox and a white cow, symbols of purity. The furrow he traced wasn't deep, but its meaning was vast. Within the Pomerium lay the city of the living, Rome's heart, its shrines, homes, and altars. Outside lay the world of chaos, war, and wilderness. Inside, soldiers laid down arms. No army could enter the Pomerium under arms, not even Rome's own legions. This was sacred ground. To violate it with violence was to offend the gods, and Rome, even in its most brutal moments, never forgot the gods. The Pomerium reminded its people that power had limits, that certain spaces belonged not to kings or generals, but to the divine. Over time, the line expanded. As the city grew, the Pomerium was redrawn, but always with ceremony, always with care. Emperors would later seek to stretch it, to match Rome's swelling pride. But the original idea never vanished, that some lines should not be crossed. The Romans believed the city itself had a soul, genius loci, the spirit of place. The Pomerium protected that spirit. It whispered of ancient rules, rules older than empire, older than kings, and so, as the sun rose over the new city of Rome, its stones warmed under light, but its soul rested in shadow, born of myth, shaped by ritual, bound by invisible lines. Unbroken bonds, Rome began its long journey. A journey that would stretch across continents and centuries. But in the quiet of its first day, before conquests and Caesar, before empire and collapse, Rome was just a whisper on the wind. A whisper of wolves, of hills, and of something eternal. Eternal. Chapter 2: Kings and Omens. In the earliest centuries of Roman memory, before the Senate rose and emperors claimed divine right, the city was ruled by kings. 7 of them, the old stories say. Each left his own mark, some as builders, some as warriors, all as symbols. They were not simply rulers of men, they were bridges between the human and the divine. Their decisions were guided not only by reason or strength, but by signs, omens cast in bird flight, thunderclaps and firelight. It began with Romulus, the city's founder. After the blood of his brothers soaked the earth, Romulus reigned with fierce authority. He created Rome's first army, chose its first senators, and opened the city to outsiders, fugitives, freedmen, exiles. Under him, Rome was both a haven and a proving ground. But his end was mysterious. One day, in the midst of a storm, Romulus vanished. Some said he was taken by the gods, others whispered of betrayal. Either way, his legacy stood tall. Then came Numa Pompilius, a man of peace. Where Romulus built with stone and war, Numa shaped time and soul. He brought the rhythms of ritual into Roman life, structuring days around the will of the heavens. The people learned to pause, to pray, to observe. Following Numa came Tullus, Hostilius, who turned back to battle. He destroyed Alba Longa, the city of Rome's own ancestors. Under him, Rome grew in power, but also in restlessness. He built the Curia, the Senate house, yet failed to calm the storms he raised. Then came Ancus Marcius, who balanced war and peace, expanding Roman territory while founding its first prison and its first bridge over the Tiber. He fortified the city, shaped its harbour at Ostia, and ensured that Rome did not collapse under the weight of ambition. With the 5th king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Etruscan blood entered the royal line. He built the Circus Maximus and laid foundations for the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer that still echoes with the past. He brought in symbols of kingship, purple robes, golden thrones, ivory scepters. Power now had spectacle. After him came Servius Tullius, born of humble origin, perhaps even a slave, but crowned by fire. Legend says his head once caught flame in his sleep, a divine sign of destiny. He gave the city its first census, dividing Romans by class and duty. He built walls, both of stone and law. And last came Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius the Proud. He seized power through bloodshed, ruled with cruelty, and ignored the warnings of gods and men. His end would mark the close of Rome's age of kings, 7 rulers, each a thread in Rome's tapestry. But their reigns, however varied, were always shaped by signs from beyond, a whisper of divine fate in every crown. Numa's quiet rule. When Romulus vanished, the people were restless. The sword had shaped their city, but now they longed for something gentler. In the Sabine hills they found Numa Pompilius, a man known not for conquest, but for wisdom. He did not seek the crown. He accepted it only after the people insisted and the signs approved. Numa was different. Where Romulus had ruled by command, Numa ruled by rhythm. He believed in the slow breath of time, in the steady turn of seasons. He listened not to generals, but to priests, and he brought something Rome had never truly known: ritual. Under Numa, temples rose, not just for beauty, but for balance. He built shrines to Janus, god of beginnings and endings, whose temple doors stayed open in war and closed in peace. During Numa's rule, those doors remained shut, a symbol of rare stillness. He reformed the Roman calendar, aligning months with moon cycles and festivals with harvests. He introduced priesthoods, the flamines, the vestals, the augurs, each charged with watching the sky and keeping Rome in harmony with the gods. More than anything, Numa taught reverence. He reminded the people that Rome was not just stone and sword, but soul and silence. Under his rule, farmers planted with blessings, homes were guarded by household spirits, and sacrifices were made not in fear, but in gratitude. He also introduced sacred laws, unwritten but binding. These laws shaped how Romans would think for centuries, that religion was not a separate act but part of daily life, that the gods were not distant but ever-present, watching, waiting, whispering. Numa Pompilius ruled not with armies but with omens, and though he left behind no battlefield victories, his reign left something more enduring, a sense of rhythm, of sacred time that beat quietly beneath Rome's later grandeur. The rise of Etruscan power. As the kingship passed into new hands, so too did influence shift. The Etruscans, Rome's northern neighbours, had long watched the city's rise. They saw potential, but also something familiar. Slowly, Etruscan ways seeped into Roman life. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the first Etruscan king to rule Rome. Under him, the city took on new shapes. Great public works began. The Cloaca Maxima, the mighty sewer that drained the marshy lands between the hills, was carved through earth and stone. It was a feat of both engineering and will, turning swampland into usable space. But the Etruscans brought more than bricks. They brought signs. They believed in divination, especially through augury, the reading of bird flight. The Romans had known such practices, but the Etruscans elevated them. The sky became a script, the ground a language. Every decision from battles to buildings was tied to omens. They also brought arches, an innovation that would allow Rome's architecture to stretch skyward in future centuries, though the glory of aqueducts and triumphal arches would come later. The seeds were planted here. Clothing changed. Kings now wore purple-bordered togas, held ivory scepters, and sat in ornate chairs. These were Etruscan symbols of rule, adopted eagerly by Rome. Even the royal guard, the lictors carrying rods and axes, came from Etruscan tradition. Their presence was not just about security, it was about spectacle, about reminding the people of order, authority, and divine favor. Under the Etruscans, Rome became more than a hilltop town. It became a statement, a place where ritual and rule blended, a city no longer just Latin, but something more complex, shaped by the flow of foreign customs, yet turning them Roman. The Etruscans did not just influence Rome, they helped birth its ambition. The fall of the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius the Proud, took the throne through violence. He murdered his predecessor Servius Tullius in the halls of the palace, and from that first act his rule was marked by cruelty. He ruled without counsel, without consent. He ignored the Senate and silenced dissent. His building projects were grand, including the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, but his methods were harsh. Laborers were forced, voices were stilled. Fear settled over Rome, not fear of invasion, but of their own king. The final blow did not come from politics, but from personal shame. Tarquin's son, Sextus, committed a vile act. He violated Lucretia, a noblewoman renowned for her virtue. In the silence that followed, Lucretia took her own life, leaving behind a message. Rome must no longer be ruled by tyrants. Her death struck a chord deeper than any decree. It awakened something in the Roman people, something old, something powerful, a sense that kingship had become corruption, that the crown no longer protected but crushed. Lucius Junius Brutus once thought. Slow-witted stepped forward. He gathered the people. He spoke not just of injustice but of dignity. And in that moment the city changed. The Romans overthrew their king. They vowed never to bow again. The monarchy was ended. The doors of royal power shut. In its place, a new system emerged, the res publica, the public thing. It was imperfect, shaped by elites and still filled with flaws. But it was different. No one man would hold absolute power again. Tarquinius the Proud fled, his name a warning. And so Rome stepped into a new age, not with celebration, but with solemn resolve. The last king was gone. But his shadow would linger. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Republic. In the quiet that followed the fall of Tarquinius Superbus, something rare stirred in the heart of Rome, a space between fear and hope. For generations kings had ruled, some wise, some cruel, but all powerful. Now that power had been broken, and in its place something untried began to grow. It was not built overnight. There was no great monument to mark the Republic's first breath. Instead, it began with an oath, spoken not in ceremony, but in resolve. The people of Rome, led by men like Lucius Junius Brutus, vowed never again to be ruled by a king. The monarchy had collapsed under its own weight, not through war with foreign armies, but through the violence of one man's greed and the people's quiet refusal to endure it. From that pain, the Republic was born. Its structure was simple at first. 2 consuls would share power, elected yearly, so that no single man could dominate. Behind them stood the Senate, an old body, once advisory, now holding the threads of Rome's future. The assemblies of the people, too, began to find their voice. No longer subjects, the citizens of Rome became participants, but this new order was fragile. There were no blueprints, no guidebooks, just memory and fear and hope. In the early days, the Republic felt more like a promise than a system, a promise that Rome could govern itself, not by the will of one, but by the will of many. That power could be watched, shared, questioned. It was not perfect. The old families, the patricians, still held most of the wealth and influence, but the seed had been planted. Rome would no longer kneel. The Republic was not just a rejection of monarchy, it was an experiment in balance, a tightrope walk between tradition and change. It would take centuries to refine and only moments to threaten. But in this chapter of history, it was enough that the people had chosen to begin. The struggle of the orders. Though the monarchy had fallen, power did not fall equally. In the new republic, 2 classes began to take shape, divided not by borders, but by birth. On one side stood the patricians, families who traced their lineage to the city's earliest days. They owned the land, held the priesthoods, and filled the ranks of the Senate. Their names echoed in marble and law. On the other side were the plebeians, the common folk, farmers, artisans, tradesmen. They fought in Rome's wars, paid its taxes and built its roads, but their voices carried little weight in the halls of decision. What followed was not a civil war, but a long, slow standoff, what historians would call the struggle of the orders. A silent revolution that lasted centuries. It began with quiet refusals. Plebeians, weary of being sent to fight without rights, walked away, literally. They withdrew to a hill outside the city, an act now called the First Secession. Without its workforce, Rome faltered, and for the first time the patricians listened. Concessions followed. The office of the tribune of the plebs was created, men elected by the plebeians with the power to veto unjust laws. Their bodies were declared sacred. To harm a tribune was to challenge the gods themselves. Still tensions remained. The plebeians wanted more than protection. They wanted equality, land, debt relief, the right to marry into patrician families. At times, progress came through peaceful demand. At others, it was wrestled inch by inch from a resistant elite. This struggle was not marked by battles, but by laws, speeches, and public pressure. And though slow, it reshaped the Republic. Over time, plebeians gained access to priesthoods, to higher magistracies, even to the consulship itself. What had once been a city ruled by bloodlines slowly opened its gates to merit and voice. The struggle of the orders was never loud. It moved in shadows, in ink, in silence, but it proved that Rome's greatness did not lie in conquest alone. It lay in the tension between power and justice, between heritage and change. The 12 Tables. In the earliest years of the Republic, the law was a living thing, spoken aloud, passed down from magistrates, and known only by a few. This left the plebeians vulnerable. Justice could shift like wind, and in a city where rights depended on knowledge, secrecy became power. So the plebeians made a simple demand: write the laws down, fix them in stone, or better, in bronze, so all could. See, the result was the 12 Tables. Created around 450 BCE, they were Rome's first written laws, 12 slabs of bronze displayed in the forum for all citizens to read. Laws in the modern sense, but rules, clear, sharp, and unchanging. They covered everything: family, property, debt, punishment, inheritance. Some lines were harsh. A thief caught at night could be killed. A debtor could be bound, even sold. But others protected the weak. They set limits, clarified rights, and established a shared reference point for justice. For the first time, law was not just a tool of the elite. It was a mirror of the people's voice. Children memorized the 12 Tables in school. Tribunes used them to challenge unfair rulings. They became the backbone of Roman legal thinking for centuries. But the significance of the 12 Tables went beyond their content. They marked a shift in power, from memory to permanence, from privilege to principle. No longer could a patrician magistrate invent the law. It was there, cast in metal for all to see. Over time, new laws would be added, others would fall away. But the memory of the 12 Tables endured. They stood as a fragile shield, forged from protest, protecting those who had once been voiceless. In the echo of their creation, Rome became a place where words, not just weapons, held sway. The censors and the Senate. As the Republic matured, its institutions deepened. Power was still shared, but its shape became more structured. At the heart of it all stood the Senate, a body older than the Republic itself, now growing in influence with every passing year. The Senate held no armies, it passed no binding laws, yet its voice carried through every corner of Roman life. It advised magistrates, managed foreign affairs, and guarded tradition. It moved slowly, carefully, always dressed in ceremony. Senators were not elected by the people, but appointed, first from patricians, then eventually from all classes. They served for life, their decisions often shaped more by custom than command. In this chamber, change came in whispers, not waves. To ensure the Senate remained worthy of its task, Rome created the office of the censor. Elected every 5 years, censors counted the people, not just their numbers, but their property, their social rank, their conduct. The census they held was a moment of reckoning. Citizens were registered, taxed, classified, but more than that, they were judged. Censors had the power to expel senators, to strip public rights, to shape the moral character of the city. Their task was not to command, but to cleanse, to maintain the dignity of Rome, not through battle, but through balance. They also oversaw public works, roads, aqueducts, temples, reminding the people that strength was built, not just won. In time, the Senate would become the soul of the Republic, a place where decisions lingered before taking form, where Rome's values were preserved, debated, and sometimes transformed. And though power would rise and fall, though war and empire would shake the foundations of the state, the Senate's presence remained, a steady, solemn reminder that Rome's greatness was not only in what it conquered, but in how it governed itself. Chapter 4. Fire Across the Sea. Across the shimmering blue waters of the Mediterranean, beyond the reach of Roman roads and the whispers of Roman gods, there stood another power, Carthage. To the Romans it was both distant and dangerously familiar. An echo, a rival, a mirror. Carthage was older than Rome. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, it had grown not from conquest but from trade. Its harbours were full of sails and spices, copper and cloth. It dealt in silver, in slaves, in purple dye drawn from sea snails. Where Rome's strength came from soil and sword, Carthage's came from ships and coin. The city itself was a marvel. Rising from the North African coast, it gleamed with towers, temples, and broad, curved walls. Its double harbour, one for commerce, one for war, was carved with stunning precision. Merchant ships bustled through one entrance while sleek war galleys rested in quiet symmetry behind fortified docks. Carthage was ruled not by kings or emperors, but by magistrates called suffetes, and a powerful council of elders. It had no senate, like Rome's, no consuls who marched with legions. Instead, it was a city of merchants and admirals, of contracts and negotiation. But beneath the polished surface, it was no less ambitious. In its temples, strange rites were whispered to Baal Hammon and Tanit, gods of fire and fertility, whose offerings sometimes stirred unease in Roman hearts. To Roman eyes, Carthage seemed foreign, almost unknowable. Yet the two cities shared something essential, a hunger to endure. At first they kept their distance, Rome looking north and inland, Carthage stretching south and west across the sea. But seas shrink with time, and mirrors do not stay still. As Rome reached the edge of the Italian peninsula and Carthage tightened its grip on Sicily, their worlds collided. What had once been two powers growing apart now stood face to face, and when they did, the result was not diplomacy. It was war. The First Punic War. When the first clash came, it was not by design. It began with a quarrel in Sicily, a place both cities coveted, yet neither fully controlled. In 264 BCE, Roman legions crossed the strait, stepping onto the island for the first time. Carthage responded. Neither side expected what would follow. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. It was Rome's first war beyond land, its first trial at sea. At the start, Rome had no fleet, no shipyards, no naval commanders. But necessity breeds invention. Within months, the Romans built warships, modeling them on captured Carthaginian vessels. Crews were trained with discipline, not skill. Sea battles were turned into floating land battles using boarding ramps called corvus, bridges with iron spikes that locked onto enemy decks. The Carthaginians laughed at first. They had ruled the sea for generations, but laughter faded as Roman persistence took hold. The war stumbled forward, one island, one harbour at a time. Carthage had the navy, Rome had the will. Battles were fought at Mylae, Ecnomus, Drepana. Fleets were lost to storms. Thousands of men were swallowed by waves, more by war. Sicily became a graveyard of ambition, but Rome learned. Slowly, clumsily, it kept building, kept sending ships, kept adjusting its grip. And when Carthage faltered, overstretched, undersupplied, Rome pressed harder. By 241 BCE, Carthage could fight no longer. Its treasury drained, its fleet battered, it sued for peace. Rome, unaccustomed to victory at sea, had become a naval power. But the cost was enormous. The sea, once distant and mysterious to Rome, had become a field of ruin. And though treaties were signed, though coins were exchanged, the sea still smouldered. Beneath the waves, resentment brewed. The mercenaries' revolt defeated Carthage, turned inward. Its leaders promised peace, but peace proved fragile. After the war, thousands of mercenaries, foreign soldiers who had fought for Carthage, returned home, expecting payment. The city delayed. Funds were short. Arguments rose between generals and treasurers. Weeks turned to months. Tempers sharpened. And then, in a grim echo of past mistakes, Carthage refused to pay. The mercenaries rebelled. What followed was not just a mutiny, it was a nightmare. The mercenary war, or the truceless war as some called it, tore Carthage apart from within. The rebels captured cities, blocked roads, and demanded vengeance. They marched under no flag, bound not by nation, but by rage. They desecrated temples, executed envoys, and used crucifixion as a message. For a time it seemed Carthage might fall, not to Rome, but to its own hired hands. But Carthage, wounded though it was, fought back. Led by the general Hamilcar Barca, father of a boy who would one day change history, the city crushed the revolt in fire and blood. It took years. Whole towns were emptied, fields burned. But in the end, Carthage survived. Rome watched from across the sea. It did not intervene, but it remembered. It saw a rival weakened, humbled, and it understood something new. Carthage, though proud, was not invincible. The war had ended, but the wounds had not healed, trust had broken, pride had cracked, and beneath the silence that followed, something darker stirred. The peace would not last. A treaty of smoke. The treaty that ended the First Punic War was carved in words, not goodwill. Carthage surrendered Sicily, paid heavy tribute, and agreed to limits on its expansion. Rome, now confident, claimed new lands. But the ink dried too fast. The fire had not burned out. Carthage turned its gaze to Iberia, modern-day Spain. There, rich mines glistened and new cities rose. Hamilcar Barca led the expansion, rebuilding Carthage's strength far from Roman reach. His family, the Barcids, became symbols of ambition. His son Hannibal was raised with one purpose: to challenge Rome. Rome, too, grew restless. It watched Carthage's movements with wary eyes. Even peace became a contest of trade routes, allies, and treaties laced with suspicion. There were no more battles, but the tension thickened like smoke. Every new harbour was a provocation, every new alliance a threat. Diplomats smiled through clenched teeth. Treaties were signed but never trusted. The Mediterranean, once vast and scattered, was now a stage, and on that stage stood two powers, each wary, each wounded, each waiting. The First Punic War had ended with silence, but it was not peace. It was a pause. The next war would not be clumsy. It would be colder, smarter, and far more devastating. Rome and Carthage had seen each other clearly now, not as strangers, not as traders, but as rivals bound by fate. The treaty may have ended the war, but it had not ended the fire. Chapter 5. Hannibal at the Gates. In a quiet chamber, lit by flickering oil lamps and watched by solemn faces, a boy placed his hand upon a sacred altar. Before gods carved in stone and fire, he swore an oath not of loyalty, but of vengeance. His name was Hannibal Barca. He was the son of Hamilcar, the Carthaginian general, who had once held Rome at bay and rebuilt Carthage's strength in the silver-rich hills of Iberia. Hamilcar had seen the Roman Republic for what it was. Relentless, disciplined, unyielding. He had fought them, studied them, and now he shaped his son to finish what he could not. The boy Hannibal grew among soldiers and maps beside war elephants and hardened men. His education was war. His bedtime stories were tales of siege and treachery. And behind it all, always, was the promise he had made beside that altar to carry his father's hatred across generations. But Hannibal's hatred was not born of rage. It was colder, quieter, not the fire of impulse, but the chill of purpose. He did not dream of conquest for glory. He studied Rome not to admire it, but to understand it, and then to undo it. By the time he was 26, Hannibal commanded armies. With Iberia as his base, he expanded Carthaginian control, securing alliances, suppressing uprisings. Rome, watching from afar, grew uneasy, but it was not until the city of Saguntum fell, an ally of Rome and a rival of Carthage, that unease turned to war. Rome declared it, Hannibal answered, and with that the boy's oath awakened. A storm began to move. Crossing the Alps, Rome expected a war in Spain, perhaps in Sicily, perhaps at sea. But Hannibal, shaped by a lifetime of anticipation, did what few imagined. He marched for Italy, through Gaul, through winter, through the impossible heights of the Alps. The journey was madness, some said, suicidal. But to Hannibal it was a path carved by necessity. The Alps were not just mountains, they were walls of ice and silence, where snow buried the sky and death crept beneath every step. With tens of thousands of men, horses, and nearly 40 elephants, Hannibal ascended. The passes were narrow and treacherous. Roman allies tried to block his path. Avalanches claimed lives. Freezing winds split flesh and snapped will. But still he moved. Food was scarce. Soldiers slipped. Pack animals fell to their deaths. The elephants, towering symbols of dread, stumbled in the snow. Yet Hannibal pushed forward. At times he carved paths through rock, using fire and vinegar. At others he offered his men not comfort, but resolve. For 15 days they climbed, for 15 nights they endured. And when at last they descended into the plains of northern Italy, they were not the same army that had set out. Fewer, yes, exhausted, but alive. Rome had not expected this. What followed was a campaign unlike anything the Republic had known. Hannibal's army was far from home, cut off from reinforcements, deep in enemy territory, but it was led by a man who understood movement, terrain, and the human heart. Rome was about to meet an enemy who didn't just challenge its armies, he challenged its sense of invincibility. Cannae, a circle of death. The year was 216 BCE. Rome had suffered losses, but pride had not yet cracked. Determined to crush Hannibal once and for all, the Republic assembled a force of more than 80,000 men, the largest army it had ever fielded. They met Hannibal on the wide plains of Cannae in southeastern Italy. The sun rose over dust and discipline. The Roman legions stood in dense, deep formation, prepared to press forward with brute strength. Hannibal had fewer men, many weary from years of marching. But he had something else, a plan as sharp as a blade. He arranged his troops in a shallow crescent. His weakest units, Spanish and Gallic soldiers, formed the center. Stronger African infantry stood back in reserve. Cavalry anchored the flanks. It was a trap disguised as vulnerability. As the battle began, the Roman legions advanced, driving into the center as Hannibal had hoped. His front lines slowly gave way, step by step, appearing to collapse. Rome surged forward, deeper and deeper into the crescent, and then the sides closed. Hannibal's African infantry, waiting quietly, wheeled inward. His cavalry, having defeated Rome's horsemen, swept behind. The Roman army, now packed tightly in the center, found itself surrounded on all sides. There was nowhere to run. No room to fight, only chaos. In a single day, Rome lost as many as 50,000 men. Entire legions were annihilated. The consuls were divided. One slain, the other fled. Blood darkened the soil, and the Tiber seemed to whisper of disaster. Cannae was not just a defeat, it was a shattering. A lesson in how intelligence can undo strength, a memory that would haunt Rome for generations. And Hannibal, the boy who had sworn revenge, had kept his promise. He had brought Rome to its knees without ever setting foot inside its walls. The shadow on Rome. After Cannae, all of Italy trembled. Cities defected, allies wavered. Even some Roman citizens began to question whether the Republic could survive. And yet, despite the fear, despite the chance to march on the capital, Hannibal paused. He did not strike Rome directly. Some said he lacked the siege engines. Others said he awaited reinforcements from Carthage. Whatever the reason, the city remained untouched. But it was not unshaken. For 15 years, Hannibal roamed Italy. He moved like smoke. Here, 1 month, gone the next. His presence was a constant ache in the Roman mind. Towns changed sides. Armies were sent against him, only to retreat or fall. He wintered in enemy lands, walked among the fields of Latin farmers, and reminded Rome that it was never truly safe. Children grew up in his shadow. Parents spoke of him in hushed tones. The Senate debated his every move. Rome fortified, reorganized, and watched the horizon. Yet the longer he stayed, the more the tide began to shift. Rome adapted. It learned patience. It stopped chasing Hannibal and began rebuilding from within. New generals emerged. Young commanders like Scipio Africanus began to study the man who had shaken their world. Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, but he became isolated. His allies thinned, his supplies grew uncertain, and eventually Rome carried the war to Carthage's doorstep, forcing Hannibal to return home. At Zama in North Africa, he met his match. Scipio, now seasoned and sharp, defeated him in 202 BCE. The war ended. Hannibal lived on in exile, never captured, never forgotten. But even in defeat, he lingered. In Roman nightmares, in Roman law, in the very spirit of its military reforms. He had never breached the walls. But for a generation, he had stood just beyond them like thunder on the horizon. Chapter 6. When Rome struck back. The war had dragged on for over a decade. Italy bled under Hannibal's heel, and Rome endured. But endurance had its limits. The people grew weary. The Senate searched for hope. And in the shadows of this weariness, a young man stepped forward. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was not yet 30. His father and uncle had both died fighting Hannibal in Spain. He came from nobility, but what he asked for was unprecedented command of Roman forces in Hispania. Despite his youth and lack of official rank, the Senate hesitated, then, perhaps moved by desperation, agreed. Scipio went to Spain not to stall but to conquer. And he did. With speed, cunning, and a keen understanding of enemy minds, he defeated Carthaginian generals, won cities, and turned allies. His victories reshaped Rome's control in the West. But more than that, they revealed his vision. He saw the war not as a siege of Italy, but as a struggle of hearts. Carthage's heart must be struck. So he proposed a new plan. While Hannibal remained in Italy, cut off from reinforcements, Scipio would sail south. He would take the war to Africa itself. It was audacious, dangerous, a gamble few thought wise. But Scipio understood something Rome had long forgotten. Carthage feared invasion. In 204 BCE, with a small but disciplined force, he landed on North African shores. There, he formed alliances with local kings, including the Numidian prince Massinissa. While Carthage scrambled to respond, he moved fast, winning battles, burning camps, and unsettling the calm that had long protected Carthage from Rome's reach. It worked. The Senate in Carthage, panicked, summoned Hannibal home. The man who had haunted Italy for 15 years returned to face the man who dared to bring fire to his homeland. The final battle would not be in Rome. It would be in the red earth of North Africa. The Battle of Zama. On the flat, open fields near Zama in 202 BCE, the war that had scarred 2 continents drew toward its close. 2 of the greatest military minds in history stood opposite one another. Hannibal, seasoned, shadowed, commanding what strength Carthage had left. And Scipio, confident, composed, carrying Rome's rising hope like a silent banner behind his calm eyes. Hannibal had more men and 80 war elephants. Scipio had fewer, but better trained, and Numidian cavalry under Massinissa, swift and skilled. As dawn broke, the elephants were released. A rumble surged across the plains. Scipio, expecting this, had formed his ranks with gaps, lanes through which the beasts might pass harmlessly. Roman trumpeters blared their horns. The elephants panicked, veered, trampled, friend and foe alike. The charge broke apart before it began. Then the infantry clashed. For hours, dust choked the air. Shields slammed, spears shattered, lives ended with silence. The lines surged and recoiled. Carthage held its ground until Scipio's cavalry, having routed Hannibal's horsemen, returned from the flanks and swept into the rear. Carthage broke. Thousands were slain. The veterans Hannibal had brought from Italy were gone. Hannibal himself survived, but knew the war was lost. He rode back not in triumph, but in memory. At Zama it was not just a battle that ended, it was an era. Rome, scarred by so many defeats, had learned, adapted, and risen. And in the red dust, with the sun setting over broken shields and silent armor, Scipio was named Africanus, the man who conquered Africa. But even in victory, Rome did not gloat. It moved cautiously, its wounds still fresh, its pride tempered. By years of fear, Carthage was defeated, but not destroyed. Not yet. Carthage in chains. After Zama, Carthage could not resist. It begged for peace, and Rome granted it, but with terms that hollowed the city from within. Carthage was forced to surrender. Its fleet, every ship hauled from its harbours and burned, masts cracking like dry bone under Roman fire. It paid a staggering indemnity in silver to be delivered over 50 years. It could no longer wage war without Rome's permission, even to defend itself. Its economy collapsed. Its pride was clipped. Once, Carthage had ruled the waves. Now, its ports stood quiet, its marketplaces thinned, its streets watched by memory more than law. Still life continued. The people rebuilt what they could. Merchants returned to trade. Farmers tended the fields. Children were born into a city that remembered its greatness, but lived in its shadow. Yet beneath the surface, something dangerous stirred. Hatred. The memory of Zama never faded, nor did the shame. And in Rome, that hatred was returned. For many senators, especially Cato the Elder, Carthage's existence was a risk too great. He ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same cold words. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. But for now, Rome waited, watching, preparing, letting Carthage live, but never truly free. The chains were not of iron. They were of condition, of fear, of law. But they were chains all the same, and Carthage, once queen of the sea, now lived as a servant of silence. Rome, master of the West. With Carthage humbled and Spain secured, Rome stood unchallenged in the Western world. It had risen from near defeat to complete dominance, controlling the seas, commanding the legions, and claiming the spoils. But Rome did not simply absorb land, it absorbed ideas. From Carthage, it learned trade. From Spain, it gained silver. From Greece, which it now eyed, it would soon take philosophy, language, and art. The Republic was still young, but no longer fragile. It governed provinces through governors, extracted taxes, and built roads that stretched across continents. Its legions became permanent forces, its fleets constant on the seas. Sicily became its first province, then Sardinia, then Corsica, and more would follow. With victory, though, came change. Wealth flooded into the city. New classes emerged. Inequality deepened. Slavery expanded. And the simple values that had once defined the Republic, frugality, honor, shared duty, began to erode. Rome had survived Hannibal. But now it faced something more subtle, the challenge of success. For now, though, it stood tall. Its enemies bowed, its people celebrated, and Scipio Africanus, who had saved the Republic, faded quietly into retirement, refusing dictatorship, declining fame, and reminding Rome of its better self. But peace in Rome never lasted long. Carthage was defeated, not erased, and even as the dust of Zama settled, the embers still glowed beneath. For Rome had won the West, but the world was wide, and its hunger had only just begun. Chapter 7. Brothers and Blood. In Rome, growing fat on conquest and gold, the voice of the poor began to fade. The Republic, once bound by duty and modesty, now shimmered with luxury. Vast estates spread across Italy, worked by slaves, while the small farmer, the Roman heart, withered beneath debt and disillusion. Out of this quiet despair rose two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were not outsiders. They were born into one of Rome's noblest families. Their grandfather had faced Hannibal at Cannae. Their mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Scipio Africanus himself. They were raised in marble halls, taught to speak with elegance and clarity. But something in them looked downward, toward the people forgotten by history's climb. Tiberius was the first to step forward. In 133 BCE, as a tribune of the plebs, he stood before the Roman people and asked a question not of law, but of conscience. Why, he wondered, should the land conquered in Roman wars belong to the few? Why had the spoils of empire enriched only the wealthy, while veterans returned to nothing? He proposed a law to return public land to the poor, not as charity, but as restoration, a return to balance, a remembrance of the old ways when Rome was stronger because it was simpler. His words did not roar. They rolled gently through the forum like a distant storm. But the wind they stirred was cold. The Senate, protective of its estates and power, bristled. Tiberius had touched a nerve older than laws, privilege disguised as stability. Still he moved forward, and beside him the people gathered, not with weapons but with hope. For the first time in years, someone in the marble halls of Rome spoke their pain aloud. Reform and resistance. Tiberius Gracchus's proposal was not radical in principle. It aimed to enforce an ancient law limiting how much public land one man could hold. But time had hardened that law into dust, and those who now held that land were unwilling to let it go. The Senate blocked him. So Tiberius turned directly to the people. Using his power as tribune, he bypassed the Senate, placing the proposal before the citizens' assembly. It passed. The Land Commission was formed. The reforms began. But with every success, tension grew. The Senate saw not justice, but insubordination. They accused Tiberius of reaching for tyranny, of threatening the Republic by defying its traditions. Behind smiles, daggers were drawn. Then Tiberius did something that sealed his fate. When his fellow tribune tried to block further reforms, Tiberius had him removed from office, an act within his power, but deeply controversial. He also sought immediate re-election, breaking with custom. To his followers, it was prudence. To his enemies, it was a step toward monarchy. The Senate began to whisper, and then to plan. The streets of Rome filled with unease. Reform had moved. Too fast, too boldly. Tiberius, once the golden son of the Republic, had become its warning light. And in the shadows of the Curia, men who claimed to defend the Republic prepared to destroy a part of it. Death in the assembly in 133 BCE. During a public vote, Tiberius Gracchus stood on the Capitoline Hill, wearing a simple toga and a crown of laurel, a sign of his service to the people, not his ambition. But the Senate saw only a symbol of revolt. A mob formed, led by senators and their clients, armed not with swords but with chair legs, table legs, and stones. The violence was sudden, chaotic, and without mercy. Tiberius fell, struck down not on the battlefield, but in the heart of Rome by the very men who had claimed to uphold its laws. Alongside him, 300 of his supporters died. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber, unburied and unmourned by the state. For a time, Rome fell silent. But history did not stop. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus, younger and sharper, entered the public stage. Like his brother, he became tribune, but he was more experienced, more deliberate. He expanded the mission: grain subsidies for the poor, military reform, new colonies for resettlement, and courts to hold corrupt senators accountable. He spoke with fire and clarity. His reforms reached deeper, and the Senate's fear returned. Opposition grew. Tensions spiraled. Gaius, once surrounded by allies, found himself isolated. A bounty was placed on his head, weight in gold for his severed body. On a dark day in 121 BCE, as violence broke out, Gaius fled to a sacred grove with a single servant. There, knowing what would come, he ordered the servant to take his life before capture. The servant obeyed, then took his own. Gaius's body was never found. His head, it is said, was weighed in molten lead to increase its value. 2 brothers, 2 deaths, and a silence in Rome that no orator could fill. The seeds of civil war, the Gracchi, were gone, but their shadow remained. Their reforms had been buried, their followers scattered. But something irreversible had happened. Violence had entered Roman politics. It had not been an invasion. It had come from within, from senators who killed a tribune, from mobs funded by fear, from ambition cloaked in tradition. The Republic had cracked, and in that crack the future stirred. The deaths of the Gracchi showed the people something dangerous. That law could be broken if the Senate willed it, that the rich would kill to protect their privilege, that the sacred offices of the Republic were not immune to blood, and, slowly, others began to learn that lesson. In the decades that followed, power shifted. Tribunes became more radical, generals became more political, citizens became more divided. Marius would rise, then Sulla, then Caesar, and with each, Rome would drift further from the delicate balance it once claimed. The Gracchi had not sought to destroy the Republic. They had hoped to save it. But their deaths revealed a deeper truth. Rome was changing. The empire had outgrown the ideals that birthed it. The poor grew restless, the rich more fearful, and the Senate less able to bend. What began with a plea for land ended in silence, but beneath that silence the seeds of civil war took root, and Rome, though still grand, would never again be whole. Chapter 8. The Republic Trembles. In a Rome growing vast with conquest, the cracks beneath its surface deepened. The Republic stretched farther than ever before, into Africa, Gaul, and the East, yet its institutions remained ancient, rigid, built for a smaller world. Wars demanded soldiers, but farms lay abandoned. The old pool of land-owning citizens, once Rome's proud legionnaires, had thinned. Into this silence stepped Gaius Marius. Born to a modest family in Arpinum, he was no patrician. Yet he rose through merit, not birth. He was a new kind of Roman, ambitious, grounded, and unafraid to challenge the old order. And he would change the Republic forever. In 107 BCE, Marius became consul. His task? To fight a war in Numidia, in North Africa. But his real war was with tradition. The Roman army, once composed solely of landowners, could no longer meet the demands of empire. So Marius did something radical. He opened the legions to the landless poor. For the first time, men who owned no property, who had no wealth, were allowed to serve and be equipped by the state. In return, they received pay, plunder, and the promise of land upon retirement. It was a turning point. The legions swelled with eager men, and these soldiers, lifted from poverty, did not see the Senate as their savior. They looked to Marius, they marched for him, they cheered for him. He had given them identity, purpose, and the hope of reward. Marius fought and won. He crushed the Numidians. He later defeated invading Germanic tribes, saving Rome from disaster. He was hailed as the savior of the state. He was elected consul 7 times, an honor without precedent. But with each victory, Rome shifted. The army was no longer a tool of the Senate. It belonged to the man who led it, and the Republic, so careful for centuries to prevent kingship, had sown the seeds of military loyalty over civic duty. Sulla's march. If Marius opened the door to power by popularity, Lucius Cornelius Sulla would walk through it with steel. Sulla was aristocratic, refined, and dangerous in his calm, a master. Of tactics he served under Marius and proved brilliant in war. But where Marius sought change through force of charisma, Sulla believed in precision, through fear, through law, through control. In 88 BCE, both men stood at the edge of history. A war against Mithridates, king of Pontus, loomed in the east. It was Sulla's command. The Senate had assigned it to him, but Marius, now aging, wanted it for himself. He used his old influence to have the order reversed, and Sulla responded with something Rome had never seen before. He marched on the city. With 6 legions behind him, Sulla crossed the sacred boundary of the Pomerium, an invisible line Roman. Law declared no general could breach with armed troops. It was more than illegal. It was unthinkable, but he did it anyway. Streets that once echoed with debate now echoed with the tread of iron. The Senate scattered. Marius fled. Sulla entered. The city not as a consul, but as a conqueror. It was the first time a Roman army had been used against Rome itself. It would not be the last. Sulla restored his command. Then with his enemy in exile he left to wage war in the east. But the spell had been broken. The Republic had been pierced. And when Sulla returned years later, he would not be content with influence. He wanted total control, prescriptions and power. When Sulla returned from the east in 83 BCE, Rome was different, but so was he. The city had changed hands. Civil war had erupted in his absence. Marius, though dead, had left a legacy of opposition. Sulla crushed it. He entered Rome once again with blood on his hands, and this time he stayed. He made himself dictator, not in the old temporary sense, but with near absolute power. And then he set out to cleanse the Republic. What followed was called the Prescriptions. Sulla published lists, names of those deemed enemies of the state, senators, equestrians, rivals, critics. Their lives were forfeit. Anyone could kill them, anywhere, and claim a portion of their wealth. Fathers died before their sons. Friends turned on each other. Heads were nailed to the rostra in the Forum, where speeches had once stirred the people. The city lived in silence. An estimated 2,000 citizens were executed, their property seized, their families ruined. The Senate, once defiant, now obeyed. Sulla rewrote the constitution. He weakened the power of the tribunes, strengthened the Senate, and restored old customs. But it was done not with consensus, but with a sword. And then he walked away. In 79 BCE, Sulla resigned the dictatorship. He retired to the countryside where he wrote memoirs and raised peacocks. He died quietly with no uprising, no punishment, no trial. Rome had bled under his rule, but it had survived, or so it seemed. Sulla had proved something terrible, that with enough force any law could be broken, any title claimed, any enemy silenced, and once that truth had entered the Republic, it could never be forgotten. The Republic. On the edge after Sulla, the Republic tried to recover. Elections resumed, courts reopened, senators returned to speeches and rituals, but beneath the marble something had shifted forever. Power no longer obeyed law, it obeyed fear. The people had seen armies used to seize the city. They had watched. Lists of citizens turned into death sentences. They had learned that tradition was fragile and ambition had teeth. New figures rose, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, all shaped by the memory of Sulla, all determined not to be the ones left behind. Pompey had fought alongside Sulla and earned the nickname the Great. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, had funded armies with his own coin, and Caesar, a young man who barely escaped Sulla's purges, would one day wield charm like a weapon. Each of them understood the new Rome. That glory was no longer in serving the state, but in mastering it, and the people, weary of chaos, began to look not to the Senate but to strong men, to generals, to those who could feed them, protect them, and bring order. The Republic still stood. The temples still held prayers. The Senate still met. But the soul of Rome had begun to drift from the law to the sword. And soon that drift would become a tide. Chapter 9. The Rise of Julius Caesar. In a city filled with ancient names, power often passed through bloodlines and tradition. But Julius Caesar, though born into nobility, began as little more than a name among many, one thread in Rome's crowded tapestry. His family, the Julii, claimed descent from Venus herself, but in practice their influence had faded. When Caesar was a boy, his house had no fortune, no powerful allies, no guarantee of greatness. He walked through the Forum, not as a rising star, but as a distant heir to a forgotten legacy. But Caesar carried something different, not merely noble birth, but something far more dangerous, charm. He spoke with elegance, dressed with care, and moved through the world like it owed him a future. And slowly, quietly, he began to gather what his family lacked. As a young man, Caesar survived the purges of Sulla by fleeing Rome. He returned only when it was safe, carefully aligning himself with the people rather than the Senate. He took bold risks, speaking in courts, leading troops in minor campaigns, and marrying wisely. Every move was calculated. He borrowed heavily to gain favor. Debts turned into dinners, debts turned into votes. Friends became followers, rivals underestimated him. In the shadows of Roman politics, he rose by smiling, listening, and promising more. In 60 BCE, he formed an alliance with two powerful men, Pompey the Great and Crassus the Rich. This informal pact, known later as the First Triumvirate, gave Caesar the support he needed to rise further. He was elected consul in 59 BCE and soon after secured a command in Gaul, a land far from the Senate's reach, but close enough to cast a long shadow. He was no longer just a name. He was a presence, and in Gaul, that presence would become legend. The Gallic Wars. Gaul was not one land, but many. Tribes and forests, rivers and mountains, cultures older than Rome's memory. To the Romans, it was a wild frontier. To Caesar, it was a stage. From 58 to 50 BCE, Julius Caesar led his legions across this land. He did not just fight, he documented. His commentaries, the Gallic War, were written in clear, sharp Latin, making his victories sound noble, just, even inevitable. But behind the prose lay fire and blood. He subdued tribe after tribe, using alliances when needed and war when not. His tactics were ruthless. He crossed rivers in the dead of night, built bridges faster than time allowed, and laid sieges with terrifying efficiency. Villages were burned, rebels crucified, entire regions brought to heel. Yet Caesar always framed his actions as defensive, as if Gaul had invited conquest, and Rome merely answered. The turning point came at Alesia in 52 BCE. The Gallic leader Vercingetorix had united his people against the Roman advance. In a hilltop fortress, he waited for relief from allied tribes. Caesar, outnumbered, encircled the stronghold with walls, then built another ring of fortifications facing outward. Trapped between siege and relief armies, the Romans held firm. After weeks of starvation and assault, the Gauls surrendered. Vercingetorix laid down his arms. The war was over. Gaul was Roman. Caesar returned to Rome a hero in the minds of many. He had expanded the empire, secured its borders, and enriched the state. But others saw something more troubling. He had built a private army, loyal not to the Senate, but to him. He had tasted command, wealth, and admiration that no law could contain, and the Senate, jealous and afraid, demanded he disband his forces, but Caesar had not crossed Gaul to return as a private citizen. He had come too far. Crossing the Rubicon, in January of 49 BCE, Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon, a small river marking the legal boundary between his province and the Roman heartland. By law, no general could cross it with armed troops. To do so was treason, rebellion, civil war, and Caesar crossed it. The river itself was narrow, quiet, almost unremarkable. But the moment echoed through time. With it, Caesar declared that he would not submit, that Rome would change not by vote, but by march. The phrase alea iacta est, the die is cast, would later be remembered as his declaration. But the truth was simpler. The choice had already been made. Panic gripped the capital. Pompey, now Caesar's rival, fled with the Senate. The Republic, unprepared, unraveled. What followed was not swift. It was a civil war that stretched across years and continents, from Italy to Greece, from Egypt to Spain. Caesar pursued Pompey, defeating him at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Pompey fled to Egypt and was murdered by a foreign king seeking favor. Caesar wept at the sight of his rival's severed head. In Alexandria, he stayed too long, entangled in the politics of the Egyptian court and in the presence of Cleopatra, who would later bear his child. He returned to Rome victorious, but not healed. The Senate had been humbled, his enemies silenced. He was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. But peace did not follow, because even as he wore the laurel crown, others sharpened their knives. Dictator for life. Caesar's Rome was not yet an empire, but it no longer felt like a republic. He controlled the legions. He passed laws with speed. His image appeared on coins, an honor once reserved for gods. Statues rose, prayers were offered. To many, he had restored order. Bread was plentiful. Gladiators returned to the arenas. The poor were given land. Time, it seemed, had settled, but others saw a warning in the stillness. The Senate, now largely ceremonial, watched as Caesar gathered titles: consul, imperator, pontifex maximus. Some wondered if he would soon become king, and though Caesar rejected the crown when it was offered in public, the suspicion remained. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, that suspicion became action. Inside the theatre of Pompey, surrounded by men he had once called allies, Caesar was stabbed 23 times. His blood pooled beneath a statue of his former rival. Among the assassins were Brutus and Cassius, senators who believed they were saving the Republic. But what they killed was not a tyrant. They killed the last chance for peaceful change. Caesar's death did not restore the old ways. It shattered them. Riots followed. The people mourned. The city boiled with uncertainty. And into that chaos stepped men like Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. The Republic was no more. It had been broken long before the knife was drawn. But with Caesar's fall it no longer trembled. It collapsed. Chapter 10. Et tu, Brute. The morning of March 15th at 44 BCE dawned quietly. In the streets of Rome, merchants unlatched their stalls, senators dressed in white togas, and the sun touched the marble temples with soft golden light. There was no sense at first of what would unfold. No trumpet, no omen in the sky, only history, waiting. In the theatre of Pompeii, where the Senate had been meeting during renovations to the Curia, the conspirators gathered. 60 men had conspired. Senators, friends, former allies. They hid knives, beneath their robes and words, behind their smiles. At the centre of it all stood Gaius Julius Caesar. He arrived late. A bad dream had kept him. His wife, Calpurnia, had pleaded with him to stay home. But fate does not yield to warning. Caesar entered the hall unaware, or perhaps aware, but resigned. As he took his place, the circle closed. One senator approached with a false petition. Another pulled Caesar's toga. The first blade struck near his shoulder. Then a second, a third. Chaos broke through order. Caesar fought at first. Then, seeing Brutus, his friend, perhaps like a son, among the attackers, he let go. 23. Wounds marked his body. He fell not in battle, not in exile, but in the heart of Rome. Beneath the statue of Pompey, whose rivalry he had long buried, the symbolism hung heavy, like a curtain closing over a tragedy too vast for stage. There was no speech, no final line, just blood in the dust and silence, the death of a dream. The conspirators had acted not for power, but for principle. At least, that was what they told themselves. They called themselves liberatores, liberators. Men who had struck to save the Republic, not destroy it. They believed that by killing Caesar they would restore the old order. A Rome of laws, not men. Of elections, not edicts. Of tradition, not tyranny, but dreams built on blood rarely hold. The people did not rejoice, they mourned. Caesar had given them grain, land, and spectacle. He had made them feel seen. To them, he was not a tyrant. He was the man who had brought stability, who had given them peace after decades of civil war. In the days after the assassination, Rome held its breath. The conspirators, expecting cheers, found fear. They had killed a man, but not a movement. The Senate did not fall into harmony. It fell into disarray. The Republic, instead of rising, staggered. In silence, Rome drifted toward something far more dangerous than a single ruler. Chaos. And into that chaos another voice began to rise. Antony's. Fury Mark Antony had been Caesar's friend, ally, and consul. In the days after the assassination, he played the part of a peacemaker, offering safety to the conspirators, calming the crowd, holding the line between riot and revolt. But beneath the calm, grief simmered into rage. At Caesar's public funeral, Antony stood before the Roman people, holding not a weapon, but the will. He read Caesar's final words aloud, words that promised land and money to the citizens, a final gift from a dead man. Then he lifted Caesar's blood-soaked toga, and the city ignited. The crowd, already uneasy, now boiled. They tore benches from the forum, built a pyre, and burned Caesar's body in the open air. His funeral became an uprising. The conspirators fled. Antony had not shouted. He had not ordered violence. He had simply let Caesar's blood speak. In the days that followed, Antony seized control. He secured the treasury. He claimed authority over Caesar's legions. He promised to honor the dead man's legacy and to punish those who had ended it. But Antony was not alone. From the east, a new name entered the story, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, young and untested, but backed by Caesar's name, and his fortune. The two would soon collide, but for now, Antony stood at the center of the storm. Not just as a man, but as the voice of Caesar's memory turned from mourning into momentum, the ghost in the forum. Julius Caesar was dead, but in Rome he was more present than ever. Statues of him were crowned with flowers. His likeness appeared in homes, in prayers, in dreams. The Senate, once cautious, now passed a decree. Caesar was to be worshipped as a god. Divus Julius. No Roman had ever been deified in life, but Caesar, in death, became something greater than mortal. His temple would rise in the Forum. His spirit, they believed, had ascended. A comet appeared in the sky weeks after his death, and the people said it was his soul, burning into eternity. But more than temples and stars, Caesar lived in Rome's choices. Octavian, now styling himself these Caesars. Heir claimed his legacy with quiet resolve. He spoke less than Antony, but moved faster. He raised troops, forged alliances, and waited. Within a year, Antony and Octavian joined forces with Lepidus, another commander. They formed a new triumvirate, 3 men ruling not by law, but by power. Together they hunted the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fled to the east, raising armies of their own. But at Philippi in 42 BCE they fell. Brutus, the last to die, fell on his sword. The Republic, already shattered, was now buried. Caesar's ghost lingered, not in vengeance but in transformation. His life had ended, but the Rome he reshaped was just beginning. The old Republic had crumbled beneath ambition. The new empire would rise from its ruins, and at the heart of that transformation stood a man who had crossed every line, broken every rule, and still captured the hearts of his people. In memory, in marble, in myth, Caesar remained. Chapter 11. Heir of the Storm. Barely 19, Octavian stepped onto history's stage with little more than a name, and a name newly changed. Born Gaius Octavius, the great-nephew of Julius Caesar, he had grown up far from the thunderous center of Roman power. His hands were still soft from books and letters, not yet calloused by the weight of command. Yet when Caesar fell to the knives of betrayal, he left behind more than blood. In his will, he named Octavian his adopted son and heir. It was a strange inheritance. The streets of Rome, once orderly beneath Caesar's rule, had fractured into whispers, grief, and fear. The Senate, ever calculating, turned its back on the dead dictator's legacy. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and co-consul, tried to seize control of the will and the city, and amid this chaos the boy stepped forward. He did not arrive with legions. He came quietly. A pale youth with deep-set eyes and a calm that unnerved men twice his age. He read Caesar's will aloud to the people, a performance not of grief, but of promise. The crowd listened as he told them what had been left to them: money, land, stability. And just like that, the boy who had no army found something far more powerful: the people's favor. But favor is not a shield. Rome was not yet his. The Senate still saw him as a child. Antony saw him as a nuisance, and the armies saw him as a question mark. Yet beneath Octavian's calm voice was a storm. He was not Caesar, but something colder, something more patient. While Antony stirred chaos, Octavian gathered support, not with speeches, but with silence, letters, gold, promises. He began to raise an army, recruiting Caesar's veterans with quiet conviction. Every step forward was calculated, every gesture rehearsed. He wore the face of a dutiful son, but his eyes already held empire. The second triumvirate. By 43 BCE, the storm could no longer be ignored. The Republic's machinery groaned under the weight of its wounds. Brutus and Cassius, the ringleaders of Caesar's murder, had fled east, gathering armies of their own. Rome stood between memory and war. Something had to give, and so it did. 3 men, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus, came together in blood and convenience, not friends, not even true allies, but necessary. Together they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship carved into Roman law for 5 years. They divided the empire among themselves. Antony would take the east, rich in wealth and mystery. Octavian claimed the west, fractured but familiar. Lepidus, aging and cautious, held Africa. Each man, powerful in his own right, agreed to peace. But that peace was made of sand. To secure power, they reached for darkness. A prescriptions list was drawn, names of enemies to be hunted, silenced, erased. Cicero, the great orator and voice of the old Republic, was among the first. He had mocked Antony, praised liberty, warned of tyranny. And for that, his name was inked into death. Octavian, the boy who once spoke softly, signed that list with steady hands. His youth did not hesitate. He knew what survival cost, and so Rome became a city of whispers and disappearances. The triumvirs offered Rome order, but it came at the price of blood. For now the alliance held. But beneath the smiles and statues, each man measured the other. Octavian watched Antony closely. He learned not just politics but performance, how to speak in Senate halls, how to wear triumph without joy. He understood that real power was not seized in one stroke. It was worn slowly, like a crown of iron. Revenge in Philippi. 2 years after Caesar's murder, vengeance marched east. The armies of the Second Triumvirate met the forces of Brutus and Cassius on the plains near Philippi. The earth there was flat, but history rippled across it like a wave, 2 sides, 2 futures, all sharpened into steel. Octavian was not the most seasoned commander. Illness plagued him during the campaign. It was Antony who led the charge, commanding troops with flair and fury. Yet Octavian remained at the heart of it, a symbol, a name, an heir whose cause had become a banner. The first battle ended in confusion. Brutus held the upper hand, while Cassius, misled by poor reports, believed all was lost. He took his own life before truth could correct him. A general dead by his own hand, not the first, not the last. In the days that followed, the second battle brought finality. Brutus too chose death over capture. He fell on his own sword, whispering farewell not just to friends, but to a republic already fading in memory. The war for Caesar's justice was over. The assassins were dead. The republic, that fragile dream of senators and balance, lay buried with them. But the war for Rome itself had only just begun. Octavian returned from Philippi with a heavier gaze. He had seen how vengeance shaped men, and how it broke them. He spoke less, observed more. Antony drank in his glory, but Octavian measured his next move. The boy had become something else, not yet emperor, but no longer anyone's shadow. Rome divided again. Peace, for a breath, settled on the empire. But it was peace drawn in chalk. Time, like rain, would wash it away. Antony, now seated in the east, fell deeper into Egypt's glow. There he met Cleopatra, queen, strategist, symbol of old kingdoms and seduction. Their alliance was political, then personal, then dangerous. Rome watched as Antony slipped further from their world, adopting foreign customs, whispering dreams of a new capital on the Nile. Octavian did not rage. He calculated. He fed Rome's stories of Antony's decadence, of Cleopatra's sorcery, of Eastern gods replacing Roman virtues. He painted himself as a defender of tradition, a son of Italy, a guardian of Caesar's legacy. While Antony dreamed, in gold and incense, Octavian built something sturdier: loyalty. Lepidus, the third triumvir, had outlived his usefulness. With quiet efficiency, Octavian stripped him of power, sent him into retirement, and assumed control of Africa. No civil war, no scandal, just another chess piece removed from the board. Now only two men remained. Friends no longer. Brothers in ambition, rivals in fate. War crept close again, not of vengeance this time, but of direction. Two Romes imagined by two men. In 32 BCE, Octavian made his move. He unveiled Antony's will, a document, real or forged, that shocked the Senate. It claimed Antony wished to be buried in Egypt, that he had left lands to Cleopatra's children. That Rome, in his hands, would become a province of desire. It was all the Senate needed. War was declared not against Antony alone, but against Cleopatra. A clever twist of words that made Octavian's war feel like Rome's war. In 31 BCE, the seas near Actium bore witness to destiny. Octavian's fleet, under the command of Agrippa, met Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Wind and flame, oar and arrow, all collided. Antony fought well, but his ships were cornered. Cleopatra fled first. Antony followed. And in that moment, the illusion broke. They returned to Egypt. There, in the quiet of defeat, the lovers chose death. Antony fell by his sword, Cleopatra with the bite of a serpent. Legends were born that day, and a tragedy of empire, of the end of resistance. Octavian entered Egypt not as a conqueror, but as something colder, a man who had outlived all rivals. He did not destroy the monuments. He did not erase Cleopatra's name. He simply absorbed it all. Titles, lands, memory. The Mediterranean now bowed to one name. His. Chapter 12. Octavian versus Antony. As Rome rose, so too did its shadows. Among them walked Mark Antony, a soldier of charisma, ambition, and contradiction. In the wake of Caesar's death, Antony had helped shape the fragile balance of the second triumvirate. But his gaze, restless and untethered, turned east to Egypt and to Cleopatra. She was no stranger to power. Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, ruled with a grace sharpened by survival. Her lineage traced back to Ptolemy, to Alexander the Great, but her throne stood surrounded by Roman influence and internal decay. She saw in Antony not just a lover, but an ally, a shield against Roman hunger, and a chance to shape her own empire in Rome's reflection. Antony, already assigned the East by the triumvirs, lingered in Alexandria. There, the rhythms of Egypt soothed his military heart. It was a world of soft linen, incense, and golden evenings. Cleopatra offered him more than affection. She offered a new identity, one that strayed far from the marble columns of Rome. Together they fashioned a life of divine theatre. They called themselves Dionysus and Isis. gods in human form. Their children were given Roman and Egyptian titles alike. They sailed the Nile in royal processions, held feasts that stretched for days, and whispered of a new power that would rise from the east, a power that might eclipse Rome itself. But while their union blossomed beneath Egyptian stars, Rome watched with unease. Antony's long absences, his growing allegiance to a foreign queen, his declarations in Alexandria, they sparked questions. Was he still Roman, or had he become something else? In Italy, the murmurs began. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was a threat. And Antony, once Caesar's loyal general, now seemed lost in dreams of incense and empire, propaganda and war. Octavian saw the danger and the opportunity. His rise had never depended on brute strength alone. It was built on narrative, on perception, on timing. And now the stage was set. He did not attack Antony with swords. He attacked him with stories. Octavian painted Cleopatra as a seductress who had ensnared one of Rome's most powerful sons. He said Antony no longer answered to the Senate, but to a queen across the sea. He whispered that Antony had promised Roman lands to Cleopatra's children, that he intended to rule Rome from Alexandria, that he would abandon Roman traditions for Eastern luxury. It was a campaign of fear, elegant and effective. Octavian knew that Romans feared decadence more than they feared war. They had grown proud of their stoic virtues, their disciplined ways, and in Antony, now seen reclining in Egyptian splendor, they saw betrayal. The Senate was divided, but Octavian forced their hand. In 32 BCE, he presented what he claimed was Antony's will, discovered or stolen, depending on who told the tale. It confirmed everything the rumors suggested. Antony, it said, wished to be buried beside Cleopatra in Egypt. He had recognized her children as heirs to foreign lands. He had placed Egypt, not Rome, at the center of his future. Whether the will was authentic mattered less than the storm it stirred. The people, already wary, turned. The Senate declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke of political framing. A Roman civil war disguised as a foreign conflict. Octavian had drawn the line. It would be Rome against the East, order against seduction, tradition against excess. And Antony, once beloved, stood on the wrong side of that line. Actium, the last naval war. The war that followed was not won in a single moment. It was slow, deliberate, and fought across sea and story. In 31 BCE, the final clash approached. The location was Actium, a narrow, strait along the western coast of Greece. On one side stood Octavian's fleet, led by Agrippa, his trusted admiral. Their ships were lighter, faster, better suited to the winds. On the other, Antony's navy waited, larger, more ornate, slowed by its own ambition. Antony and Cleopatra had gathered their forces with care, but time worked against them. Disease crept through their camp, supplies dwindled, morale frayed, and across the waves Octavian tightened his grip. The battle began with wind and oars. For hours the sea churned, with shouts, sails, and smoke. Cleopatra's ships, stationed at the rear, held firm until they didn't. In a sudden, shocking move, her fleet turned and fled toward the open sea. Antony, caught between duty and desire, followed. Some said he believed the battle lost. Others claimed he couldn't bear to lose Cleopatra. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The heart of his fleet was abandoned. The remaining ships, leaderless, collapsed. Octavian did not need to destroy them all. The flight had done the work for him. What began as a contest of strength ended as a collapse of unity. Antony and Cleopatra escaped to Egypt, but their cause had already sunk beneath the waves. Actium was not just a military victory, it was symbolic. It was the end of a dream. The dream of a Rome ruled from the east, of gods living as mortals on the Nile. Octavian returned home, not just as a victor, but as a symbol of stability. He had not only defeated an army, he had preserved Rome's image of itself. The end of a republic. Antony and Cleopatra's final days were quiet, marked by waiting. In Alexandria, as the walls of power closed around them, they prepared for the end. Antony, once a warrior of thunder and wine, found only silence. His army scattered, his honor debated, and his legacy unsure. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, attempted to negotiate. She tried to bargain with Octavian, offering her a crown, her riches, even her life, so long as her children were spared. But Octavian was unmoved. He wanted no rival heirs, no myth to outshine his own. When defeat became certain, Antony fell on his sword. It was a soldier's death, slow, uncertain, filled with regret. Cleopatra followed, her method wrapped in legend, the bite of an asp, or perhaps poison hidden in a comb. However it happened, the result was the same. With their deaths, the last true resistance to Octavian vanished. Egypt became a Roman province. The East, once a counterweight, now bowed to Rome's will. Octavian stood alone. No rivals, no co-rulers, no republic in the old sense. The Senate still met, still spoke, still voted, but only as a shadow of what it had been. Rome had changed, slowly, subtly, completely. Octavian did not crown himself king. He understood that the word king carried weight, the kind that crushed men in Rome. Instead, he took titles. Princeps, meaning first citizen. Augustus, meaning revered one. Titles that seemed humble, but held more power than any crown. The Republic technically still existed, but it breathed only through him. A government wrapped around one man's will, presented as the will of the people. Rome, once ruled by consuls and senates, now moved to the rhythm of one voice. The roads were quieter, the legions steadier. The people, weary of chaos, welcomed peace, even if it came in the form of empire. And so the Republic, born in the fires of kings cast out, raised on the laws of balance and debate, passed into memory. Not with a final decree, but with a sigh. It had not been murdered, it had been outlived, and in its place Octavian stood, not as a tyrant, not as a god, not yet, but as something new. The first of many emperors, the last of the republicans. The storm had passed, the sea was calm, and Rome at last belonged to one. Chapter 13. The Age of Augustus. He never called himself a king. Kings had fallen, driven from Rome centuries earlier. The very word was poison in the mouths of senators and citizens alike. But what Octavian became after Actium was something greater and far more subtle. He was the princeps, the first citizen, a man who claimed to serve the Republic even as he quietly buried it. The streets of Rome whispered it long before the Senate dared speak it aloud. The Republic was no more. And yet there was no throne, no crown, only Augustus, modest, serene, and in total command. His power was absolute but invisible. He retained the trappings of old offices, consul, tribune, imperator, and behind each lay a new meaning. The Senate still met, But its decrees were his. Armies still marched, but under his command. Elections still occurred, but only with his blessing. Augustus understood Rome's soul. It craved strength, but loathed tyranny. So he gave the illusion of freedom while quietly tightening his grip. He relinquished powers in grand ceremonies, only to have them returned by the grateful Senate. He restructured the provinces, ensuring loyalty flowed not to governors, but to him. He controlled the treasury, the grain, the legions. He even reshaped time itself. The calendar bore his name. Statues of him multiplied. His image was stamped on every coin, the young, serene face of eternal stability. And yet he never shouted his dominion. He governed like a shadow cast at noon, constant but almost invisible. To the people, Augustus was peace after decades of chaos. To the Senate, he was protector of tradition. To the legions, he was the source of triumph. He was, in every sense, the first emperor, without ever saying so aloud. Peace and prophecy. The civil wars were over. Swords were sheathed. And in their place, stone and marble began to rise. Rome, once gritty and scarred, blossomed under Augustus. Rule into a city of white temples, orderly roads, and golden poetry. The wounds of battle gave way to the rhythm of construction and the silence of peace. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. 200 years would pass beneath its quiet skies, but it began here with Augustus. No more triumvirates, no more shifting alliances. Only one center of power, and around it a world slowly exhaling. Temples were rebuilt, not only to honor gods, but to remind Rome of its sacred roots. The temple of Mars Ultor, god of vengeance, stood as a solemn monument to justice fulfilled. Roads stitched together the empire like veins, flowing with soldiers, merchants, ideas. The Via Appia stretched like a spine from Rome to the south, lined with milestones bearing the emperor's name. Poets, too, flourished. Horace wrote of love and fate, Ovid of desire and transformation. But it was Virgil who captured the new, Rome best, in the Aeneid, a tale of destiny, loss, and divine purpose. Augustus himself was woven into its verses, seen as the fulfillment of a prophecy that began with Aeneas fleeing the ruins of Troy. Rome was not just a city. It was fate, written in the stars. And Augustus sat at its center, like a still point in the turning world. He governed with order and foresight. Provinces were pacified, tax systems rationalized, grain was distributed with precision. Even the calendar, once haphazard, now ticked with imperial accuracy. It was an age of grandeur, not through bloodshed, but through balance. And as the city swelled in wealth and order, a myth began to form, that Augustus had found Rome in brick and left it in marble. The return of morality. But Augustus saw more than building. He looked into Rome's soul and saw decay. Luxury, indulgence, and neglect of duty. These were the enemies now. To secure Rome's future, he believed, its spirit had to be restored. And so he set out to rebuild not just walls, but values. He passed laws not of conquest, but of character. Marriage was encouraged, divorce discouraged, families were rewarded, childlessness penalized. The Senate was expected to lead by example. Adultery, once overlooked in elite circles, was now a crime, even for the emperor's own kin. The moral reforms extended into every corner of Roman life. Women of status were expected to bear children and uphold virtue. Men were called to service, to honor, to restraint. Augustus revived old priesthoods, old rites, old festivals, not out of nostalgia, but to re-anchor Rome in the discipline of its past. He lived simply, or at least gave the appearance of doing so. He dined modestly, wore plain clothes, avoided grand feasts. He became a living model of the values he imposed, humble, dutiful, self-controlled. The people believed it, or perhaps they simply needed to. This was a different kind of empire, not one of gold and glory alone, but one of virtue, or at least the image of it. Augustus knew that an empire could fall from within long before enemies reached its gates. So he cultivated restraint, reverence, and civic pride as shields against decline. Statues of him depicted not a warrior or conqueror, but a calm, fatherly figure, hand raised, eyes forward, a leader in peace as well as war. Morality became law. Tradition became policy. Rome, under Augustus, learned to march not only with legions, but with ideals, shadows of succession. And yet, for all his foresight, one question haunted the emperor's reign like a distant drumbeat: what comes after? Augustus had built a system balanced delicately upon his own presence. He had no sons, only stepsons and potential heirs by marriage. First was Marcellus, his nephew, young and promising, but Marcellus died suddenly. Then came Agrippa, his trusted general and son-in-law, who fathered several children with Augustus's daughter, Julia. But Agrippa too passed. Others followed. Gaius and Lucius, the grandsons raised as princes of peace. Both were groomed carefully. Both died young. Time moved slowly in the Augustan age, but death did not. One by one, the candidates for succession fell away, and the question returned more sharply each time: who would wear the mask of power when Augustus was gone? In the end, he turned to Tiberius, his reluctant stepson. Stern, private, distant, Tiberius had little of Augustus's charm, but he had served in campaigns, governed provinces, and knew the machinery of empire. He was not loved, but he was capable. Augustus staged the transition carefully. Tiberius was given command, then powers, then honors. Each step a rehearsal. By the time Augustus died, the machinery kept moving. There was no rupture, no coup. The first emperor had ensured continuity. But it came at a cost. Beneath the marble calm lay silent tensions. Julia, Augustus's daughter, had been exiled for scandal. The family had been disciplined, reshaped, sacrificed. Succession was no fairy tale. It was a slow pruning, a quiet elimination of all but the most viable branch. Augustus had ruled with subtlety and wisdom. But his greatest legacy was also his greatest gamble, an empire that could survive without the man who built it. Chapter 14: Empire Without End. When Augustus died, he left behind not just an empire but an inheritance of pressure. The delicate system he had built, part republic, part monarchy, depended on a careful hand. His chosen successor, Tiberius, had the mind for duty, but not the heart for love. He stepped into power not as a savior, but as a shadow. Tiberius was cold, private, and distant. Raised in the discipline of war, he lacked Augustus's charm. He ruled from a distance, quite literally, retiring to the island of Capri, surrounded by guards and fear. The Senate grew silent, unsure how to please a man who never showed his face. The people whispered of darkness, of spies, trials, and executions that came without warning. The emperor became a presence without a person, a chill in the air, that lingered even in the warmth of Rome. He ruled for more than 2 decades, and Rome remained stable. But the spirit of the city began to dim. Authority was no longer calm and wise, it was sharp, secret, and suspicious. Then came Caligula, Tiberius's great-nephew and the son of Germanicus, a beloved general. At first, his rise brought hope. Young, energetic, and smiling, Caligula was greeted like the return of light. But it did not last. Something broke within him. Some say it was illness, others trauma. Whatever the cause, his reign turned quickly from promise to nightmare. Caligula named his horse Consul. He walked through his palace dressed as a god. He demanded worship and punished doubt. The line between performance and madness vanished. Behind the golden theatre was fear. Senators were executed for imagined insults. Families vanished. The laughter at Caligula's games grew tight and forced. And after just 4 years, the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, ended it. They found him in a corridor and struck him down. The madness was over, but it had left deep cracks in Rome's imperial mask. Claudius the Unexpected. In the chaos after Caligula's death, few looked to Claudius. He was the uncle, the scholar, the one who stammered and limped. The imperial family had long hidden him, mocking his speech, overlooking his mind. But when the Praetorian Guard lifted him from behind a curtain and hailed him emperor, Rome got something it didn't expect, a ruler who was ready. Claudius surprised everyone. Beneath the hesitation was a sharp, curious mind. He had studied history, law, and politics. While others fought or plotted, he had watched. And now, with power in hand, he began to shape the empire. He reformed the laws, cutting through the confusion of overlapping codes. He gave new voices to the provinces, inviting men outside of Italy into the Senate. He saw Rome not as a city, but as an expanding world, and he wanted that world governed well. Claudius even turned his gaze outward. In one of Rome's boldest moves, he ordered the invasion of Britain, a foggy, wild island that had resisted Roman control for a century. His generals crossed the sea and planted Rome's banner deep in its soil. For the first time, the empire touched the edge of the known world, but even as Claudius expanded Rome, shadows gathered behind him. His marriages were storms. His court was full of whispering freedmen and ambitious nobles, poison, rumor, betrayal. They circled his reign like vultures. In the end, it was his own wife, Agrippina, who brought the curtain down. She placed her son Nero in the line of succession, and Claudius, once so cautious, accepted. Soon after he fell ill. Some said mushrooms, some said poison, but Claudius, the overlooked scholar, was gone, and the stage now belonged to one of history's most infamous names. Nero's Rome. Burns, Nero rose to power as a boy emperor with poets at his side and a golden vision in his mind. At first, he played the role well. He reduced taxes, supported the arts, and spoke of peace. But behind the velvet curtains, a darker Nero watched and waited. As he grew older, so did his hunger. For praise, for applause, for control. He fancied himself a singer, an actor, a charioteer. He performed in public, demanding the empire applaud not just its emperor, but its entertainer. The Senate clapped, the people bowed. No one dared criticize the boy who believed he was the stage. But power, mixed with insecurity, those who questioned Nero disappeared. Advisors were silenced. His own mother, Agrippina, the woman who had secured his throne, was murdered under his orders. His wife, too, died by his hand. His love for art was rivaled only by his cruelty. Then, in the summer of 64 AD, fire came to Rome. It raged for days. Temples crumbled, homes vanished, and smoke turned the skies black. Whether Nero started it or not, he saw opportunity in the ashes. He blamed the Christians, a new, strange group in the city. Many were arrested, tortured, and killed. Others say Nero simply wanted room for his new palace, the Domus Aurea, a golden house built over ruins. The fire became his legend. So did the madness. His rule spiraled into chaos. Rebellions flared in the provinces. Generals turned. Armies shifted their loyalty. Nero, the once beloved performer, was now hated and hunted. In the end, alone and afraid, he fled the city. When soldiers came for him, he chose his own end, whispering his final words, "What an artist dies in me." Rome survived, but it was scarred. The year of 4 emperors. Nero's fall shattered the illusion of smooth succession. There was no chosen heir, no graceful transition, only a vacuum. Into it stepped chaos. First came Galba, an aging governor. With a stern face and a brittle rule, he tried to restore discipline, but he lacked allies. The soldiers grew restless. His own guards turned on him. Within months, he was dead. Then came Otho, a man who had once styled his hair like Nero and now styled his reign on speed. He took power quickly and lost it just as fast. A rival general, Vitellius, marched from the north with legions behind him. Otho, facing certain defeat, ended his own life. Vitellius entered Rome in triumph, but triumph is a fragile thing. He feasted while the empire shook. In the east, another general had risen, Vespasian, seasoned, respected, and waiting. His legions declared him emperor, and Rome, for the 4th time in a single year, watched a new man claim the purple. The city became a battlefield. Streets ran with blood, temples shook, brothers in arms turned on each other, but when the dust settled, Vespasian remained. He did not enter like a prince, he entered like a builder. He brought with him the calm of experience and the quiet of a man who had seen too much war. He began to rebuild not just walls and roads, but trust. Rome, exhausted, let out a long, aching breath. 4 emperors. 1 year. The empire had nearly torn itself apart, but it did not fall. Somehow it endured. Like a great river that bent but did not break, Rome kept flowing, always forward, always toward the horizon of history. History, chapter 15. Trajan and the height of Rome. Before he wore the purple robe of an emperor, Trajan wore armor. His hands had held a sword long before they held a scepter. Born in the distant lands of Hispania, far from the city of Rome, he was the first emperor to come from a province, a son of empire, not of the capital. Yet in his discipline, clarity, and command, he would come to define Rome's golden strength. Trajan was a soldier at heart. He marched with his men, ate with them, slept where they slept. He understood the weight of war and the silence that followed it. His leadership was not carved from ceremony, but from service. He believed in duty, in order, and in victory. And the empire, still strong, but stretched thin after years of indulgent rule, found in him a breath of iron. When Emperor Nerva chose Trajan as his heir, it was more than a transfer of power. It was a shift in tone. Gone was the courtly excess. In its place stood a man with clear eyes and a steady hand. Trajan became emperor in 98 AD, and almost immediately the tempo changed. He did not rule from shadows. He ruled in the open. He travelled, inspected, listened. And when he marched to war, it was not out of pride, but preparation. In the east, along the Danube, a kingdom called Dacia had long troubled Rome. Rich in gold and defiance, it had resisted previous emperors. Trajan made it a priority, not just for conquest, but for balance. And so, with armour polished and banners raised, the emperor led his legions across the river. Dacia would fall, Rome would grow, and Trajan, the soldier emperor, would become legend, Rome at its largest. Dacia was more than a victory. It was a turning point. With its defeat, Rome gained vast mines of gold, silver, and salt. Wealth poured into the empire. Coins were struck. Games were held. Temples were adorned. The city glittered with new life, funded by the conquest of mountains. But the true reward was space. The Roman Empire under Trajan now stretched farther than it ever had, from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the sands of Mesopotamia, from the green hills of Britain to the deserts of North Africa. It was a map painted with ambition. No emperor before him had ruled such a world. Trajan's eastern campaigns pushed even farther. He crossed into Armenia and Parthia, lands of ancient rivalries and hidden danger. He took cities. He crowned kings. In name, Rome now controlled parts of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilizations. The Tigris and Euphrates, once distant, rivers of myth now felt Rome's shadow fall upon them. But even victories have weight. The farther Rome reached, the more it strained. Soldiers were stretched across deserts. Governors struggled to manage unfamiliar tongues, unfamiliar customs. Supply lines grew thin. Some cities welcomed Rome, others burned at its touch. Trajan saw this. And though his spirit never wavered, his health did. The strain of travel, war, and rule wore on him. In his final years, as he moved westward again, he fell ill in the city of Selinus. There, far from Rome, the soldier emperor closed his eyes for the last time. He died not on a throne, but on a journey. A symbol of the empire he had shaped, always moving, always expanding. And when the map of Rome was redrawn in his name, it showed an empire at its peak. Never again would its borders stretch so far. Roads, arches, and Justice Trajan did not rule only with the sword. He ruled with stone. His victories may have come from battlefields, but his legacy was carved into the earth. The Forum of Trajan, in the heart of Rome, rose like a crown. Markets, basilicas, and a grand column, each told the story of a man who built as much as he conquered. Trajan's column, wrapped in delicate stone reliefs, spiraled upward like memory etched in marble. It showed the Dacian wars, it in triumph alone, but in labor, sacrifice, and sorrow. It still stands today. But beyond the city's center, his impact reached every province. Roads were repaired and stretched farther. Bridges spanned rivers, once thought uncrossable. Aqueducts brought water to the dry. Cities in Gaul, Asia Minor, and North Africa grew orderly, clean, and proud. Trajan saw infrastructure as more than utility. It was dignity. He gave grain to the poor through the alimenta, a welfare system that supported orphan children and struggling families. He reduced taxes in battered regions, restored justice in neglected courts, and governed with a steadiness Rome had long missed. He was no philosopher king. He did not speak in riddles or rule by charm, but his fairness earned him something rare: trust. The Senate respected him, the soldiers followed him, the people praised him. Even later historians, often quick to find fault, called him Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. He left behind not just laws, but a shape, a vision of what Rome could be when order met compassion and power walked with care. His arches still rise in shadow and sunlight. His name, still carved in stone, is spoken softly in the halls of history. The empire pauses. After Trajan's death, the empire stood vast and gleaming, but also tired. Its limbs had stretched beyond what even strong hands could hold. In that moment of crossroads, a new emperor emerged: Hadrian, Trajan's adopted son and successor. Hadrian was not a mirror of Trajan. Where Trajan expanded, Hadrian withdrew. He was a builder, a thinker, and a man deeply aware of limits. He did not seek more land. He sought balance, stability. One of his first acts was to let go, to abandon the eastern conquests Trajan had claimed. Mesopotamia was too far, too fragile. Instead of chasing more, Hadrian chose to protect what already existed. And in that choice, Rome learned to pause. He travelled the empire more than any emperor before him. From Britannia to Egypt, he walked among the stones, the soldiers, the citizens. He saw the provinces not as conquests, but as parts of a whole that needed care. He spoke to governors. He adjusted laws. He listened. In the far north of Britannia, where the wind cut through grass like a knife, he built a wall. Hadrian's wall, not to conquer, but to contain. It stretched across the land like a line of breath, a sigh of restraint from an empire that had once chased the horizon without end. He also built cities, villas, and temples. He honored the gods, celebrated art, and preserved Greek culture. Where Trajan had built for strength, Hadrian built for time. And yet, beneath the calm, he too ruled with a firm hand. Rebellions were crushed, critics were exiled. Peace, after all, is not always gentle. But Hadrian's legacy was not carved in conquest. It was written in the silence that followed. The empire, once thundering forward, now learned to hold still, to breathe, to endure. And in that breath, Rome discovered that greatness was not just found in reaching farther, but in knowing when to stop. Chapter 16. Crisis and Collapse. The peace that Rome once carried like a crown had faded. By the 3rd century, the empire no longer whispered with calm, but trembled with chaos. What had once been a golden world of marble roads and measured rule now shook with fire, fear, and famine. It began slowly, like a crack in stone. A plague swept through the empire, unseen, unstoppable. The Antonine plague had already thinned the population a century earlier. Now came the plague of Cyprian, cutting through cities and legions alike. Streets emptied. Temples were quiet. In some towns, the dead outnumbered the living, and still Rome was expected to stand, but the empire's edges burned. Germanic tribes crossed the frozen Rhine. Persian armies struck from the east. Pirates sailed the seas with boldness. Borders became wounds. Cities once peaceful now looked outward with dread. Inside the empire, stability became a ghost. Emperors were made not by law, but by swords. Generals crowned themselves in camps. Coins were struck with new faces, only to fade before the year. was over. Some emperors ruled for days, others never reached Rome at all. The army, meant to defend the empire, now decided who wore the purple. Between 235 and 284 AD, more than 20 emperors came and went, many through murder, some through mutiny. Their names are written in history like sparks in a storm, brief, bright, and then gone. Rome did not collapse in one blow. It crumbled in confusion. Trade slowed. Roads fell into disrepair. Inflation turned silver coins to worthless tin. Faith in the future faded, and people turned inward toward their local towns, toward their gods, and away from the great promise that had once united them. And yet in this darkness the empire still breathed, weakened, wounded, but not yet fallen. The empire splits. In the midst of the storm, a new idea began to take shape. Not born from vision, but from desperation. Rome was too large, too slow, too stretched. No single man could manage it all. And so the empire split. At first, the division was informal. One emperor ruled in the west, another in the east, 2 rulers for one empire. The division was not meant to break Rome apart, only to hold it together with both hands. But, like a vase cracked down the middle, it would never truly be whole again. The West held Rome itself, Gaul, Spain, and the misty island of Britain. The East held Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and the wealthy cities along the trade routes. The West had memory, the East had money. The armies, too, were divided. Generals commanded not for an empire, but for a region. Loyalty narrowed. Each side looked more often to its own problems, and less to the dream of unity. This was not yet the fall of Rome, but it was a quiet step toward it. Even as emperors proclaimed one empire, they ruled in halves, 2 courts, 2 capitals, 2 visions. The line between East and West was thin, but real. The split allowed Rome to endure, but it also planted a question that would never go away. How long could a house divided still call itself one? Aurelian and the Palmyrene queen. In this fractured world, heroes rose not with triumph, but with urgency. One such figure was Aurelian, a general of steel and speed. When he took power in 270 AD, the empire was a broken shell, yet in 5 short years he stitched it back together with fire and force. Aurelian fought with precision. He drove out the barbarian invaders from Italy. He crushed uprisings in the Balkans. But his greatest test came from the east, from a city called Palmyra, and a queen named Zenobia. Palmyra was no ordinary city. Nestled between desert and trade route, it was rich, cosmopolitan, and proud. When Rome faltered, Palmyra rose. Zenobia, its queen, ruled with brilliance. She took Egypt. She claimed parts of Asia Minor. She styled herself empress, not of Rome, but of a new world where Palmyra stood at the center. Zenobia was educated, elegant, and bold. She wore armor when she rode. She spoke many languages. She defied Rome not with madness, but with method. And for a time, she succeeded. But Aurelian would not let the empire fracture further. He marched east with determination. Battles flared across the sands. Palmyra resisted, but eventually the tide turned. Zenobia was captured, not slain. Aurelian admired her courage. In his triumphal parade through Rome, she was led in golden chains. Yet she was not humiliated. She was housed in comfort, remembered with respect. A warrior queen, defeated but never broken. Aurelian continued his work. He built walls around Rome itself, the Aurelian walls, vast stone arms to hold off the chaos. He called himself restorer of the world, and for a moment the world seemed mended. But like so many before him, Aurelian's end came quickly, assassinated by his own men, a bright flame. And then silence. Diocletian's reforms. Then came Diocletian, a man of structure, not sentiment. Where others had tried to save Rome with battle, he used design. He became emperor in 284 AD and immediately began reshaping everything. He did not simply divide power, he multiplied it. He created the tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 juniors called Caesars, 4 rulers, 4 capitals, 1 empire. It was not unity, but control. Diocletian understood that peace could not be wished for. It had to be enforced. And so he restructured the army, the provinces, the courts. He set maximum prices for goods to stop inflation. He issued new coins, inspected governors, and built a bureaucracy as complex as the empire itself. He was tireless and ruthless. He also launched the last great persecution of Christians. As their numbers grew, Diocletian saw them not as citizens, but as a threat to the old gods, to the old order. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, thousands died, yet still the faith endured. But Diocletian's rule brought results. For the first time in decades, Rome stood firm. The frontiers were defended, the economy stabilized. Order, even if cold and heavy, returned. Then, in a gesture as rare as it was startling, Diocletian did what no emperor had done before. He stepped down. He retired. He left power behind and lived in a palace by the sea, among gardens and stone. It was a final act of control, choosing his exit rather than being forced. The crisis had not ended, but it had slowed, and Diocletian, stern and unsmiling, had shown that even in a collapsing world, structure could hold. Chapter 17. The Fall of the West. In the early 4th century, as shadows stretched across the Roman world, one man would step forward bearing not only the legacy of emperors, but a vision unlike any before. Constantine, a general's son seasoned by war and tempered by ambition, would not only reshape the empire's borders, but its very soul. His rise was born in chaos. Civil war had returned as rival emperors fought for power in a divided empire. Constantine marched through the storm with calm precision, and on the eve of a decisive battle near the Milvian Bridge, he saw something, a sign in the sky, a cross of light above the sun, and a promise, "In this sign, conquer." The next morning, his soldiers carried shields marked not with Rome's eagle, but with the Christian symbol Chi-Rho, 2 letters forming the name of Christ. The battle was fierce, but Constantine emerged victorious, and from that moment the empire was changed. Though Christianity had been persecuted for centuries, Constantine gave it recognition. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD granted religious freedom, not just for Christians, but for all. Temples no longer burned, churches rose instead. The old gods were not outlawed, but their dominance faded, quietly. Constantine did not convert fully, not at first, but he moved steadily toward a new faith. He gathered bishops, funded churches, and brought order to doctrine. He was baptized on his deathbed, a final act of surrender, not to an emperor, but to something greater. Rome had once worshipped Mars, Jupiter, and the divine emperor. Now it knelt to a single god, crucified and risen. The empire's sword still glinted in the sun, but it was now carried beneath the shadow of the cross. A new Rome in the East. As Constantine secured his power, He turned his eyes eastward. Rome, the eternal city, was weighed down, crowded, political, aging. The future, he believed, lay elsewhere. He found it in Byzantium, a small, ancient city on the edge of Europe and Asia, where seas met and trade flowed. There, in 330 AD, he founded a new capital, Constantinople. It was not built in haste. Palaces shimmered with marble, streets stretched wide and orderly. Great churches rose beside temples, aqueducts brought clean water, markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the empire. It was a city of light, born not from the past, but for the future. Unlike Rome, which had grown slowly and organically over centuries, Constantinople was planned. It faced the rising sun, its walls were thick, its harbours deep. Strategically placed, it stood at the crossroads of continents, protected by sea and strength. More than geography, it carried a new spirit. Christianity thrived there, not as a minority faith, but as the soul of the city. Bishops held councils, the Nicene Creed was written, shaping belief for centuries to come. The city glowed with promise. It became a new heart for the empire, Eastern, spiritual, enduring. And while Rome in the west would crumble, Constantinople would stand for another 1,000 years. With this, the empire had quietly shifted. Though Rome still held memories and names, the East now held power. And Constantinople, the city of Constantine, would become the guardian of that flame, the Vandals and the Visigoths. But as Constantinople rose in splendor, the western half of the empire began to sway. Its foundations, once held firm by legions and law, were cracking. And through those cracks came the winds of change, fierce, cold, and unstoppable. For centuries, Rome had pushed outward, pressing against the forests of Germania, the steppes beyond the Danube. But the people there, the so-called barbarians, were not wild hordes. They were families, tribes, warriors, and they were moving. Some came in peace, seeking safety from other migrating tribes or from the growing pressure of the Huns, sweeping west from the heart of Asia. Others came with swords. Rome, weakened by division and decay, could not hold every frontier. In 376 AD, the Visigoths were allowed into the empire as refugees, but mistreatment bred revolt. 2 years later, they crushed a Roman army at Adrianople, killing the emperor himself. It was the first time Rome's rule had cracked so violently within its own borders. Then came Alaric, a Visigothic leader proud and weary of broken Roman promises. In 410 AD, he marched on the Eternal City. Rome had not been sacked in 800 years, and yet, for 3 days, the city was looted, not completely destroyed, but deeply wounded. The world gasped. St. Jerome, writing far away, said, "The city, which had taken the whole world, was itself taken." Later came the Vandals, crossing from Spain into North Africa, claiming Carthage, the empire's breadbasket. And in 455 they too reached Rome. This time the sack was slower, more systematic. Gold, statues, treasures, taken piece by piece. The name Vandal would echo through history as a symbol of destruction. But the truth was more complex, and they were not mindless destroyers, but opportunists shaped by a crumbling world. The Western Empire, once the master of the known world, now begged, bargained, and broke. Its defences were too thin, its emperors too weak, and its enemies, once distant, now stood at the gates. The last Roman emperor. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a ghost of its former self. The Senate still met, but had little power. Emperors were crowned and forgotten. Real authority lay in the hands of generals, mercenaries, and barbarian warlords. In 476 AD, a boy named Romulus Augustulus wore the imperial purple. He was not chosen by conquest or acclaim, but by convenience. A puppet placed on the throne by his father, a military commander named Orestes. But his reign would be short. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, once a commander in Rome's army, demanded land for his soldiers. When denied, he marched on the capital. There was no great battle, no fiery last stand. Odoacer simply removed the boy emperor and sent the imperial regalia and the crown, the robes, to Constantinople, saying there was no longer need for a separate emperor in the West. And so, quietly, without ceremony, the Western Roman Empire ended. Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West, was spared. He was sent away, perhaps to live out his days in silence, a boy who carried a name of legends, Romulus, the founder of Rome, and who closed an age, but Rome itself did not vanish. The Eastern Empire, now called the Byzantine Empire, endured. Constantinople continued to rise, Latin faded, but the Roman spirit lived on in law, in architecture, in dreams. The popes of Rome held influence. The city remained a symbol, wounded but not forgotten. What ended in 476 was not a civilization, but a chapter. A 1,000-year journey had come to a close, not with fire, but with fading. And in the quiet after, history paused, the world shifted, and a new age began. Chapter 18. The Legacy of Rome. The Western Empire had fallen, its last emperor dethroned, its cities worn by war and silence. But the story of Rome did not end there. In the east, beyond the blue waters of the Aegean, the flame of Rome still burned, not in fading ruins, but in golden halls and sacred domes. This was Byzantium, or more rightly, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Here the Roman Empire transformed but did not die. It became the Byzantine Empire, shaped by Eastern customs, Christian faith, and imperial memory. Byzantium carried the bones of Rome into a new age. Senators still gathered, emperors still ruled, but the world they moved through was different. Greek replaced Latin. Orthodox icons glowed in candlelight. The old pantheon gave way to the cross. The city itself gleamed like a pearl beside the Bosporus. Hagia Sophia, the grand cathedral, rose with grace, its dome seeming to float between heaven and earth. Its mosaics shimmered with saints, emperors, and angels, whispering stories through stone. Byzantine emperors dressed in silk, crowned in gold, and ruled with a mix of divine authority and careful calculation. They faced wars, plagues, and betrayal, yet held their ground. They called themselves Basileus, but also Roman, always Roman. For 1,000 years after the fall of the West, this Eastern Rome stood. It endured sieges, it outlasted kingdoms, it saw the rise of Islam, the Crusades, and shifting tides of trade. And though the shape of the empire changed, the identity remained. Only in 1453, when Ottoman cannons broke through Constantinople's mighty walls, did the last Roman emperor fall. His name was Constantine, just like the first. In that final breath, the flame flickered out, but even then it was not extinguished. It simply passed into memory, where it still glows. Rome in the mind, long after the emperors vanished and the legions disbanded, Rome lived on, not in palaces or provinces, but in the minds of those who dreamed. During the Renaissance, artists and thinkers turned to the ruins of Rome with wonder. They walked among broken columns, sketching the remnants of triumph. They read Latin texts, studied Roman law, and imagined the greatness of what had once been. Michelangelo carved like a Roman. Raphael painted with Roman grace. Machiavelli, in The Halls of Florence, wrote of power with the cold clarity of Caesar. They did not rebuild the empire, but they revived its spirit. Later came the Enlightenment. In Paris, London, and Philadelphia, philosophers debated freedom, justice, and the Republic, all with Roman examples in their minds. The founders of the United States called their new government a republic, modelled in part after the Roman Senate. In France, revolutionaries called themselves citizens as Rome once had. Napoleon, standing among ancient ruins in Egypt, imagined himself a modern Caesar. The eagle returned to standards, the laurel wreath adorned new brows. Even dictators borrowed Rome's shadow. Mussolini paraded through streets he called imperial. Hitler studied Roman architecture. The symbols of the empire, fasces, especuar, the wolf and twins, were used again, some in reverence, others in irony. But beyond power and politics, Rome lived in quieter places. In libraries, in classrooms, in the turning of a book's page. Its memory did not command armies, it guided imaginations. Rome became a myth, not false but larger than life, a mirror for those who longed for order, glory, and legacy. A city that had once ruled the world now ruled minds. Law, language, and law. Beneath the stories of emperors and battles lies a quieter legacy, one written not in stone, but in habits, words, and ideas. Roman law, first codified in the 12 Tables and later refined by jurists and emperors, still echoes in modern courts. Terms like habeas corpus, subpoena, and amicus curiae trace their roots to Roman legal thought. Civil law systems in Europe and Latin, America bear Rome's fingerprint, structured, methodical, bound by precedent. The Latin language, once spoken by soldiers and senators, faded from daily use. But it never disappeared. It became the language of scholars, of the church, of medicine and science. Today, its echoes live in Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, the Romance languages born from Rome's tongue. Even English, though Germanic in base, is filled with Latin roots. Justice, liberty, constitution, empire. These are Roman words carried forward by history. In religion, too, Rome left a deep mark. The Roman Catholic Church, centered in the Vatican, still carries the name of the city. The Pope walks among pillars that once saw Caesar's footsteps. Prayers rise in Latin. Saints are honored in basilicas built over Roman foundations, and in lore, in story, Rome never left. The she-wolf nursing Romulus and Remus, the betrayal of Julius Caesar, the eruption of Vesuvius, the columns of the Forum. These images fill books and screens. They inspire games, novels, films. They teach us about ambition, beauty, and the fragility of greatness. Rome is no longer a living empire, but it is still a living influence. In our laws, our words, our rituals, and our myths, Rome breathes, an empire of memory. Empires rise and fall, walls crumble, statues erode, banners fade. But some empires, though gone in form, remain in meaning. Rome was one such empire. It began as a village on the banks of the Tiber, a place of shepherds, kings, and early laws. It grew through conquest, diplomacy, and endurance. It became an idea of civilization, of order, of greatness. It was not perfect. It enslaved, it conquered, it fell into cruelty. But it also built, dreamed, and created a structure so vast that even in collapse, its shape remained. Today we do not see Roman legions marching. We do not hear the Senate debate under marble domes, but the echoes are all around us, in the roads we travel, in the domes above churches, in the concepts of citizenship, equality before the law, and republics governed by votes and voices. Rome lives in the foundations of our world, just the physical, but the mental. Its myths teach lessons. Its ruins remind us of time. Its legacy whispers, "This too shall pass, but something always remains." And so, Rome did not truly fall. It became a mirror, reflecting what we admire, what we fear, and what we hope to preserve. It became a memory shared across continents, a story told in quiet voices, in late hours, under dim light. The empire is gone, but the story of Rome, eternal, elegant, and enduring, goes on.